to start a new book today, and actually it's a whole series of books. It's actually kind of a good one. I always liked it. It's called a series, oops, let me do that better. A series of unfortunate events. And this book is called A Bad Beginning. Kind of ominous when something says a series of unfortunate events, which means bad things, and it's actually called The Bad Beginning. This book is dedicated to Beatrice, darling, dearest, dead. First, a picture of like a city with 3 kids on the back of a trolley looking sad. Chapter 1. If you're interested in stories of happy endings, you'd be better off reading some other book. In this book, not only is there no happy endings, there is no happy beginning, and very few happy things in the middle. This is because not very many happy things happened in the lives of the 3 Baudelaire youngsters. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny Baudelaire were intelligent children, and they were charming and resourceful and had pleasant facial features, but they were extremely unlucky, and most everything that happened to them was rife with misfortune, misery, and despair. I'm sorry to tell you this, but that is how the story goes. Their misfortune began one day at Briny Beach. 3 Baudelaire children lived with their parents in an enormous mansion at the heart of a dirty and busy city, and occasionally their parents give them permission to take a rickety trolley. The word rickety, you probably know, here means unsteady or likely to collapse. Alone to the seashore, where they would spend the day as a sort of vacation as long as they were home for dinner. This particular morning it was gray and cloudy, which didn't bother the Baudelaire youngsters one bit. When it was hot and sunny, Briny Beach was crowded with tourists, and it was impossible to find a good place to lay one's blanket. On gray and cloudy days, the Baudelaires had the beach to themselves to do what they liked. Violet Baudelaire, the eldest, liked to skip rocks. Like most 14-year-olds, she was right-handed, so the rocks skipped farther across the murky waters when Violet used her right hand than when she used her left. As she skipped rocks, she was looking out at the horizon and thinking about an invention she wanted to build. Anyone who knew Violet, well, could tell she was thinking hard because her long hair was tied up in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes. Violet had a real knack for inventing and building strange devices, so her brain was often filled with images of pulleys, levers, and gears, and she never wanted to be distracted by something as trivial as her hair. This morning she was thinking about how to construct a device that could retrieve a rock after you skipped it in the ocean. Klaus Balderler, the middle child and the only boy, liked to examine creatures in tide pools. Klaus was a little older than 12 and wore glasses which made him look intelligent. He was intelligent. The Baudelaire parents had an enormous library in their mansion, a room filled with thousands of books on nearly every subject. Being only 12, Klaus, of course, had not read all of the books in the Baudelaire library, but he had read a great many of them and had retained a lot of information from his readings. He knew how to tell an alligator from a crocodile. He knew who killed Julius Caesar, and he knew about the tiny slimy animals found at Briny Beach, which he was examining now. Sonny Baudelaire, the youngest, liked to bite things. She was an infant and very small for her age and scarcely larger than a boot. While she lacked in size, however, she made up for with the size and sharpness of her 4 teeth. Sonny was at an age where one mostly speaks in a series of unintelligible shrieks, except when she used a few words in her vocabulary like bottle, mommy, and bite. Most people had trouble understanding what it was that Sonny was saying. For instance, this morning she was saying gack over and over, which probably meant look at that mysterious figure emerging from the fog. Sure enough, in the distance, along the misty shore of Briny Beach, there could be seen a tall figure striding towards the Baudelaire children. Sonny had already been staring and shrieking at the figure for some time when Klaus looked up from the spiny crab he was examining and saw it too. He reached over and touched Violet's arm, bringing her out of her inventing thoughts. "Look at that," Klaus said, and pointed towards the figure. It was drawing closer, and the children could see a few details. It was about the size of an adult, except its head was tall and rather square. "What do you think it is?" Violet asked. "I don't know," Klaus said, squinting at it, "but it seems to be moving right towards us." "We're alone on the beach," Violet said, a little nervously. "There's nobody else it could be moving towards." She felt the slender, smooth stone in her left hand, which she had been about to try to skip as far as she could. She had a sudden thought to throw it at the figure because it seemed so frightening. It only seems scary, Klaus said, as if reading his sister's thoughts, because of all the mist. This was true. As the figure reached them, the children saw with relief that it was not anybody frightening at all, but somebody they knew, Mr. Poe. Mr. Poe was a friend of Mr. and Mrs. Baudelaire's, whom the children had met many times at dinner parties. One of the things Violet, Klaus, and Sonny really liked about their parents was that they didn't send their children away when they had company over, but allowed them to join the adults at the dinner table and participate in the conversations as long as they helped clear the table. The children remembered Mr. Poe because he had always had a cold and was constantly excusing himself from the table to have a fit of coughing in the next room. Mr. Poe took off his top hat, which had made his head look large and square in the fog, and stood for a moment, coughing loudly into a white handkerchief. Violet and Klaus moved forward to shake his hand and say, "How do you do?" "How do you do?" said Violet. "How do you do?" said Klaus. "Odo yow," said Sonny. "Fine, thank you," said Mr. Poe, but he looked very sad. For a few seconds nobody said anything, and the children wondered what Mr. Poe was doing there at Briny Beach when he should have been at the bank in the city where he worked. He was not dressed for the beach. "It's a nice day," Violet said finally, making conversation. Sonny made a noise that sounded like an angry bird, and Klaus picked her up and held her. "Yes, it is a nice day," Mr. Poe said, absently staring out at the empty beach. "I'm afraid I have some very bad news for you children." The three Baudelaire siblings looked at him. Violet, with some embarrassment, felt the stone in her left hand and was glad she had not thrown it at Mr. Poe. "Your parents," Mr. Poe said, "have perished in a terrible fire." The children didn't say anything. "They perished," Mr. Poe said, "in a fire that destroyed the entire house. I am very, very sorry to tell you this, my dears." Violet took her eyes off Mr. Poe and stared at the ocean. Mr. Poe had never called the Baudelaire children "my dears" before. She understood the words he was saying, but thought he must be joking, playing a terrible joke on her and her brother and sister. "Perish," Mr. Poe said, "means killed." "We know what the word perish means," Klaus said crossly. He did know what the word perished meant, but he was still having trouble understanding exactly what it was that Mr. Poe had said. It seemed to him that Mr. Poe must somehow have misspoken. "The fire department arrived, of course," Mr. Poe said, "but they were too late. The entire house was engulfed in fire. It burned to the ground." Klaus pictured all the books in the libraries going up in flame. Now he'd never read all of them. Mr. Poe coughed several times into his handkerchief before continuing. "I was sent to retrieve you here and take you to my home, where you will stay for some time until we figure things out. I am the executor of your parents' estate. That means I will be handling this enormous fortune and figuring out where you children will go. When Violet comes of age, the fortune will be yours, but the banks will take charge of it until you are old enough." Although he said he was the executor, Violet felt like Mr. Poe was the executioner. He had simply walked down the beach to them and changed their lives forever. "Come with me," Mr. Poe said, and held out his hand. In order to take it, Violet had to drop the stone. Klaus took Violet's other hand, and Sonny took Klaus's other hand, and in that manner, the three Baudelaire children, the Baudelaire orphans now, were led away from the beach and from their previous lives. All right, that's the end of chapter 1. Like it says, bad beginning. What happened to our three orphans there? Well, I just gave it away, didn't I? They're orphans. So we met which other characters? The three Baudelaire children, Klaus, Sonny, and Violet, and Mr. Poe the banker, who's now gave them the bad news for the bad beginning of our series. What was that news? Yes, their parents had died and the house was burnt to the ground. But they're going to go live with Mr. Poe for a while until he can figure out what to do with them. So that's how our series, a series of unfortunate events, is starting out. I know I wouldn't be a happy kid in that situation. But let's continue and see what happens to them. I'm sure there's going to be even worse things. Chapter 2. It is useless for me to describe to you how terrible Violet, Klaus, and even Sonny felt in the time that followed. If you ever lost someone very important to you, then you already know how it feels. And if you haven't, you cannot possibly imagine it. For the Baudelaire children, it was, of course, especially terrible because they had lost both their parents at the same time, and for several days they felt so miserable they could scarcely get out of bed. Klaus found he had little interest in books. The gears in Violet's inventive brain seemed to stop, and even Sonny, who of course was too young to really understand what was going on, bit things with less enthusiasm. Of course, it didn't make things any easier that they had lost their homes as well, and all their possession. I'm sure you know, to be in one's own room, in one's own bed, could often make a bleak situation a little better, but the beds of the Baudelaire orphans had been reduced to charred rubble. Mr. Poe had taken them to the remains of the Baudelaire mansion to see if anything had been unharmed, and it was terrible. Violet's microscope had fused together in the heat of the fire. Klaus's favorite pen had turned to ash, and all of Sonny's teething rings had melted. Here and there, the children could see traces of the enormous home they loved. Fragments of their grand piano, an elegant bottle in which Mr. Baudelaire kept brandy, the scorched cushions of the window seat where their mother liked to sit and read. Their home destroyed. The Baudelaires had to recuperate for their terrible loss in the Poe household, which was not at all agreeable. Mr. Poe was scarcely at home because he was very busy attending to the Baudelaire affairs, and when he was home, he was often coughing so much he could barely have a conversation. Miss Poe purchased clothing for the orphans that was in grotesque colors and itched, and the two Poe children, Edgar and Albert, were loud and obnoxious, with whom the Baudelaires had to share a tiny room that smelled of some sort of ghastly flower. But even given the surroundings, the children had mixed feelings when, over a dull dinner of boiled chicken, boiled potatoes, and blanched, the word blanched here means boiled, string beans, Mr. Poe announced that they were to leave his household the next morning. Good, said Albert, who had a piece of potato stuck between his teeth. Now we can get our room back. I'm tired of sharing it. Violet and Klaus are always moping around and are never any fun. And the baby bites, Edgar says, tossing a chicken bone to the floor, as if he were an animal in a zoo and not the son of a well-respected member of the banking community. Where will we go? Violet asked nervously. Mr. Poe opened his mouth to say something, but erupted into a brief fit of coughing. I have made arrangements, he said finally, for you to be raised by a distant relative of yours who lives on the other side of town. His name is Count Olaf. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny looked at one another, unsure of what to think. On one hand, they didn't want to live with the Poes any longer. On the other hand, they had never heard of Count Olaf and didn't know what he would be like. Your parents' will, Mr. Poe said, instructs that you be raised in the most convenient way possible. Here in the city, you'll be used to your surroundings, and this Count Olaf is the only relative who lives within the urban limits. Klaus thought this over for a minute as he swallowed a chewy bit of bean. But our parents never mentioned Count Olaf to us. Just how is he related to us exactly? Mr. Poe sighed and looked down at Sonny, who was biting a fork and listening closely. He is either a third cousin 4 times removed or a fourth cousin 3 times removed. He is not your closest relative on the family tree, but he is the closest geographically. That's why... If he lives in the city, Violet said, why didn't our parents ever invite him over? Possibly because he was very busy, Mr. Poe said. He's an actor by trade and often travels around the world with various theater companies. I thought he was a count, Klaus said. He is both a count and an actor, Mr. Poe said. Now, I don't mean to cut short our dinner, but your children have to pack up your things, and I have to return to the bank to do some more work. Like your new legal guardian, I am very busy myself. The 3 Baudelaire children had many more questions for Mr. Poe, but he had already stood up from the table and with a slight wave of his hand departed from the room. They heard him coughing into a handkerchief, and then the front door creaked shut as he left the house. Well, Miss Poe said, you 3 had better start packing. Edgar, Albert, please help me clear the table. The Baudelaire orphans went to the bedroom and glumly packed their few belongings. Klaus looked distastefully at each ugly shirt Miss Poe had bought him as he had folded them and put them into a small suitcase. Violet looked around the cramped, smelly room in which they had been living, and Sonny crawled around solemnly, biting each of Edgar and Albert's shoes, leaving small teeth marks in each one so she would not be forgotten. From time to time, the Baudelaire children looked at one another, but with their future such a mystery, they could think of nothing to say. At bedtime, they tossed and turned all night, scarcely getting any sleep between the loud snoring of Edgar and Albert and their own worried thoughts. Finally, Mr. Poe knocked on the door and stuck his head into the bedroom. "Rise and shine, Baudelaires," he said. "It is time for you to go to Count Olaf's." Violet looked around the crowded bedroom, and even though she didn't like it, she felt very nervous about leaving. "Do we have to go right this minute?" she asked. Mr. Poe opened his mouth to speak, but had to cough a few times before he began. "Yes, you do. I'm dropping you off on my way to the bank, so we need to leave as soon as possible. Please, get out of bed and get dressed," he said briskly. The word briskly here means quickly so as to get the Baudelaire children to leave the house. The Baudelaire children left the house. Mr. Poe's automobile rumbled along the cobblestone streets of the city towards the neighborhood where Count Olaf lived. They passed horse-drawn carriages and motorcycles along Doldrum Drive. They passed the fickle fountain, an elaborately carved monument that occasionally spat out water in which young children played. They passed an enormous pile of dirt where the Royal Gardens once stood. Before too long, Mr. Poe drove his car down a narrow alley lined with houses and made of pale brick and stopped halfway down the block. "Here we are," Mr. Poe said in a voice undoubtedly meant to be cheerful. "Your new home." The Baudelaire children looked out and saw the prettiest house on the block. The bricks had been cleaned very well, and through the wide and open window, he could see an assortment of well-groomed plants. Standing in the doorway with their hands on the shiny brass doorknobs was an older woman, smartly dressed, who was smiling at the children. In one hand she carried a flower pot. "Hello there," she called out. "You must be the children that Count Olaf is adopting." Violet opened the door of the automobile and got out to shake the woman's hand. It felt firm and warm. For the first time in a long while, Violet felt as if her life and the lives of her siblings might turn out well after all. "Yes," she said. "Yes, we are. I am Violet Baudelaire, and this is my brother Klaus and my sister Sonny. And this is Mr. Poe, who has been arranging things for us since the death of our parents." "Yes, I heard about the accident," the woman said, as everyone said, "How do you do?" I am Justice Strauss." "That's an unusual first name," Klaus remarked. "It's my title," she explained, "not my first name. I serve as a judge on the High Court." "How fascinating," Violet said. "Are you married to Count Olaf?" "Goodness me, no," Justice Strauss said. "I don't actually know him that well. He's my next-door neighbor." The children looked from the well-scrubbed house of Justice Strauss to the dilapidated one next door. The bricks were stained with soot and grime. There were only two small windows in which were closed and the shades drawn, even though it was a nice day. Rising above the windows was a tall and dirty tower that tilted slightly to the left. The front door needed to be repainted, and carved in the middle of it was an image of an eye. The entire building sagged to the side like a crooked tooth. "Oh," said Sonny, and everyone knew what she meant. She meant, "What a terrible place. I don't want to live there at all." "Well, it was nice to meet you," Violet said to Justice Strauss. "Yes," said Justice Strauss, gesturing to her flower pot. "Perhaps one day you could come over and help me with my gardening." "That would be very pleasant," Violet said, very sadly. It would, of course, be very pleasant to help Justice Strauss with her gardening, but Violet could not help but thinking that it would be far more pleasant to live in Justice Strauss's house instead of Count Olaf's. What kind of man, Violet wondered, would carve an image of an eye into his front door? Mr. Poe tipped his hat to Justice Strauss, who smiled at the children and disappeared into her lovely house. Klaus stepped forward and knocked on Count Olaf's door, his knuckles rapping in the middle of the carved eye. There was a pause, and then the door creaked open, and the children saw Count Olaf for the first time. "Hello, hello, hello," Count Olaf said in a wheezy whisper. He was very tall and very thin, dressed in a gray suit that had many dark stains on it. His face was unshaven, and rather than two eyebrows like most human beings have, he had just one long one. His eyes were very, very shiny, which made him look both hungry and angry. "Hello, my children. Please step into your new home and wipe your feet outside so no mud gets indoors." As they stepped into the house, Mr. Poe behind them, the Baudelaire orphans realized what a ridiculous thing Count Olaf had just said. The room in which they found themselves was the dirtiest they've ever seen, and a little bit of mud from outdoors wouldn't have made a bit of difference. Even by the dim light of the one bare light bulb that hung from the ceiling, the three children could see that everything in the room was filthy, from the stuffed head of the lion which was nailed to the wall to the bowl of apple cores which sat on a wooden table. Klaus willed himself not to cry as he looked around. "This room looks like it needs a little work," Mr. Poe said, peering around in the gloom. "I realize that my humble home isn't as fancy as the Baudelaire mansion," Count Olaf said, "but perhaps with a bit of your money we could fix it up a little nicer." Mr. Poe's eyes widened in surprise, and his cough echoed in the dark room before he spoke. "The Baudelaire fortune," he said sternly, "will not be used for such matters. In fact, it will not be used at all until Violet is of age." Count Olaf turned to Mr. Poe with a glint in his eyes like an angry dog. For a moment, Violet thought he was going to strike Mr. Poe across the face, but then he swallowed. The children could see his apple bob in his skinny throat and shrugged his patchy shoulders. "All right, then," he said. "It's the same to me. Thank you very much, Mr. Poe, for bringing them here. Children, I will now show you to your room." "Goodbye, Violet, Klaus, and Sonny," Mr. Poe said, stepping back through the front door. "I hope you will be very happy here. I will continue to see you occasionally, and you can always contact me at the bank if you have any questions." "But we don't even know where the bank is," Klaus said. "I have a map of the city," Count Olaf said. "Goodbye, Mr. Poe." He leaned forward to shut the door, and the Baudelaire orphans were too overcome with despair to get a last glimpse of Mr. Poe. They now wished they could all stay at the Poe household, even though it smelled, rather than looking at the door. Then the orphans looked down and saw that although Count Olaf was wearing shoes, he wasn't wearing any socks. They could see in the space of a pale skin between his tattered trouser cuffs and his black shoe that Count Olaf had an image of an eye tattooed on his ankle, matching the eye on his front door. They wondered how many eyes were in Count Olaf's house, whether for the rest of their lives they would always feel as though Count Olaf were watching them, even when he wasn't nearby. All right, so that's the end of that chapter. So the kids lived with Mr. Poe for a while. Did they enjoy that one? No, Mr. Poe was never home, and when he was coughing. His wife bought them horrible, ugly colored clothes that were itchy, and their two sons were just horrible. But he said that they were going to go live with a new guardian, Count Olaf. What was he? What did he do for a living? Even though his title says Count, he was just an actor. When they arrived at his house, did they enjoy it? No, it was dirty and gross and run down. He thought he could just use their money to fix it up. That he was told he can't, not until Violet's of age. Okay, so we're going to go on and read chapter 3. I don't know if you ever noticed this, but the first impressions are often entirely wrong. You can look at a painting for the first time, for example, and not like it at all, but after looking at it a little longer, you may find it very pleasing. The first time you try Gorgonzola cheese, you may find it too strong. But when you're older, you may want to eat nothing but Gorgonzola cheese. Klaus, when Sonny was born, did not like her at all, but by the time she was 6 weeks old, the two of them were thick as thieves. Your initial opinion on just about anything may change over time. I wish I could tell you that the Baudelaire's first impressions of Count Olaf and his house were incorrect, as first impressions so often are. But these impressions, that Count Olaf was a horrible person and his house a depressing pigsty, was absolutely correct. During the first few days after the orphans' arrival at Count Olaf, Violet, Klaus, and Sonny attempted to make themselves feel at home, but it was really no use. Even though Count Olaf's house was quite large, the three children were placed together in one filthy bedroom that had only one small bed in it. Violet and Klaus took turns sleeping in it, so that every other night one of them was in the bed and the other was sleeping on the hard wooden floor. And the bed's mattress was so lumpy it was difficult to say who was more uncomfortable. To make a bed for Sonny, Violet removed the dusty curtain from the curtain rod that hung over the bedroom's one window and bunched them together to form a sort of cushion, just big enough for her sister. However, without the curtains over the cracked glass, the sun streamed through the window every morning, so the children woke up early and sore each day. Instead of a closet, there was a large cardboard box that had once held a refrigerator. It would now hold the three children's clothes, all piled in a heap. Instead of toys, books, or other things to amuse the youngsters, Count Olaf had provided a small pile of rocks. And the only decoration on the peeling wall was a large and ugly painting of an eye matching the one on Count Olaf's ankle and all over the house. But the children knew, as I'm sure you know, that the worst surroundings in the world can be tolerated if the people in them are interesting and kind. Count Olaf was neither interesting nor kind. He was demanding, short-tempered, and bad-smelling. The only good thing to be said for Count Olaf is that he wasn't around very often. When the children woke up and chose their clothing out of their refrigerator box, they would walk into the kitchen and find a list of instructions left for them by Count Olaf, who would often not appear until nighttime. Most of the day he spent out of the house or up in the high tower where the children were forbidden to go. The instructions he left for them were usually difficult chores and such as repainting the back porch or repairing the windows. And instead of a signature, Count Olaf would just draw an eye at the bottom of the note. One morning, his note read, "My theater troupe will be coming for dinner before tonight's performance. Have dinner ready for all of them. By the time they arrive at 7 o'clock, buy the food, prepare it, and set the table, serve dinner, clean up afterwards, and stay out of our way." Below that, there was the usual I, and underneath the note was a small sum of money for the groceries. Violet and Klaus read this note as they ate their breakfast, which was gray and lumpy oatmeal Count Olaf left for them each morning in a large pot on the stove. Then they looked at each other in dismay. "None of us know how to cook," Klaus said. "That's true," Violet said. "I knew how to repair those windows and how to clean a chimney because those sorts of things interest me, but I do not how to cook anything except toast." "And sometimes you burn the toast," Klaus said, and they smiled. They were both remembering a time when the two of them got up early to make special breakfast for their parents. Violet had burned the toast, and her parents, smelling smoke, had run downstairs to see what the matter was. When they saw Violet and Klaus looking forlornly at a piece of pitch-black toast, they laughed, and they ate pancakes for the whole family. "I wish they were here," Violet said. She did not have to explain. She was talking about their parents. "They would never let us stay in this dreadful place. If they were here," Klaus said, his voice rising as he got more and more upset, we would not be with Count Olaf in the first place. "I hate it here, Violet. I hate this house. I hate our room. I hate having to do all these chores. And I hate Count Olaf." "I hate it too," Violet said, and Klaus looked at his older sister with relief. Sometimes just saying that you hate something and having someone agree with you can make you feel better about a terrible situation. "I hate everything about our lives right now, Klaus," she said, "but we have to keep our chin up." This was an expression the children's father had used, and it meant to try to stay cheerful. "You're right," Klaus said, "but it's very difficult to keep one's chin up when Count Olaf keeps shoving it down." "Jook!" Sonny shrieked, banging on the table with her oatmeal spoon. Violet and Klaus were jerked out of their conversation and looked once again at Count Olaf's note. "Perhaps we could find a cookbook and read about how to cook," Klaus said. "It shouldn't be that difficult to make a simple meal." Violet and Klaus spent several minutes opening and shutting the Count Olaf's kitchen cupboards, and there weren't any cookbooks to be found. "Can't say I'm surprised," Violet said. "We haven't found any books in this house at all." "I know," Klaus said miserably. "I'm reading very much. I miss reading very much. We must go out and look for a library sometime soon." "But not today," Violet said. "Today we have to cook for 10 people. At that moment there was a knock on the front door, and Violet and Klaus looked up at one another nervously. Who in the world would want to visit Count Olaf? Violet wondered out loud. "Maybe somebody wants to visit us," Klaus said without much hope. In the time since the Baudelaire's parents' death, most of the Baudelaire orphans' friends had fallen by the wayside, an expression here which means they stopped calling, writing, and stopping by to see if any of the Baudelaire, making them very lonely. You and I, of course, would never do this to any of our grieving acquaintances, but it is sad truth in life that when someone has lost a loved one, friends sometimes avoid the person just when the presence of a friend is most needed. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny walked slowly to the front door and peered through the peephole, which was in the shape of an eye. They were delighted to see Justice Strauss peering back at them and opened the door. Justice Strauss, Violet cried. How lovely to see you, she was about to add, do come in, but then she realized that Justice Strauss would probably not want to venture into the dim and dirty room. Please forgive me for not stopping by sooner, Justice Strauss said as the Baudelaire stood awkwardly in the doorway. I wanted to see how your children were settling in, but I had a very difficult case in the High Court, and it was taking up so much of my time. What sort of case was it? Klaus asked. Having been deprived of reading, he was hungry for new information. I can't really discuss it, Justice Strauss said, but it's official business. But I can tell you it concerns a poisonous plant and illegal use of someone's credit card. Yika! Sonny shrieked, which appeared to mean, how interesting. Although, of course, there is no way that Sonny could understand what was being said. Justice Strauss looked down at Sonny and laughed. Yika indeed, she said, and reached down to pat the child on the head. Sonny took Justice Strauss' hand and bit it gently. That means she likes you, Violet explained. She bites very, very hard if she doesn't like you, and if you want to give her a bath. I see, Justice Strauss said. Now then, how are you children getting on? Is there anything you desire? The children looked at one another, thinking of all the things they desired. Another bed, for example, a proper crib for Sonny, curtains for the window in their room, a closet instead of a cardboard box. But they were desired most of all, of course, was not to be associated with Count Olaf in any way whatsoever. What they desired most was to be with their parents again, in their true home, but that, of course, was impossible. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny all looked down at the floor unhappily as they considered the question. Finally, Klaus spoke. Could we perhaps borrow a cookbook? He said. Count Olaf has instructed us to make dinner for his theater troupe tonight, and we can't find a cookbook in the house. Goodness, Justice Strauss said. Cooking dinner for an entire theater troupe seems like a lot to ask for children. Count Olaf gives us a lot of responsibility, Violet said. What she wanted to say was, Count Olaf is an evil man, but she was well-mannered. Well, why don't you come next door to my house, Justice Strauss said, and find a cookbook that pleases you. The youngsters agreed and followed Justice Strauss out the door and over to her well-kept house. She led them through the elegant hallway smelling of flowers into an enormous room, and when they saw what was inside, they nearly fainted from delight, Klaus especially. The room was a library, not a public library, but a private library. That is, a large collection of books belonging to Justice Strauss. There were shelves and shelves of them on every wall from the floor to the ceiling, and separate shelves and shelves of them in the middle of the room. The only place where there weren't books was in one corner where there was some large, comfortable-looking chairs and a wooden table with a lamp hanging over them, perfect for reading. Although it was not as big as their parents' library, it was as cozy, and the Baudelaire children were thrilled. My word, Violet said, this is a wonderful library. Thank you very much, Justice Strauss said. I've been collecting books for years, and I'm very proud of my collection. As long as you keep them in good condition, you are welcome to use any of my books at any time. Now, the cookbooks are over there on the eastern wall. Shall we have a look at them? Yes, Violet said, and then, if you don't mind, I should love to look at any of your books concerning mechanical engineering. Inventing things is a great interest of mine. And I would like to look at books on wolves, Klaus said. Recently, I have been fascinated by the subject of wild animals of North America. Book, Sonny shrieked, which means, please don't forget to pick out a picture book for me. Justice Strauss smiled. Is it a pleasure to see young people interested in books, she said. But first, I think we'd better find a good recipe, don't you? The children agreed, and for 30 minutes or so they perused several cookbooks that Justice Strauss recommended. To tell you the truth, the three orphans were so excited to be out of Count Olaf's house and in this pleasant library that they were a little distracted and unable to concentrate on cooking. But finally Klaus found a dish that sounded delicious and easy to make. Listen to this, he said. Puttanesca. It's an Italian sauce for pasta. All we need to do is saute olives, capers, anchovies, garlic, chopped parsley, and tomatoes together in a pot, and prepare spaghetti to go with it. That sounds easy, Violet agreed. And the Baudelaire orphans looked at one another, perhaps with the kind Justice Strauss and her library right next door, the children could prepare pleasant lives for themselves as easily as making puttanesca sauce for Count Olaf. All right, it's the end of that chapter. So we've learned that Count Olaf is not a good guy, and they don't like their room. And he makes them do chores, like not just normal easy chores that everybody likes to do, like painting parts of the house and stuff. What chore did he leave them for this day? To make dinner for him and his theater troupe of 10 people, except they don't know how to cook. And so they look for a cookbook and there isn't one. But who comes to visit? Justice Strauss. And she invites him over to find a cookbook in her house. And she has a beautiful library full of books. And they get all excited. And they look. And they finally found a recipe they think they can make called puttanesca. And you serve it with pasta. It's actually really good. How do they feel when they leave her house after being in that library, being around her, knowing that they don't like Count Olaf at all because they think he's an evil man? How do they feel at the end of that chapter? They feel happy. They feel like that life could be getting a little bit better for them, even though they don't want to live with Count Olaf, as long as she's next door and they can get the books and talk to her. So that's where we're going to stop on this day. We'll see if the life actually does get better or if the bad beginning continues. So, see you then.